Hey there YouTube, I'm Forrest Latter-day Skeptic. As many of you know, my brother Jacob runs a channel called Thoughtful Faith, a channel focused more towards active church members looking to intellectually engage in religious discussions. I've made a few videos critiquing his content, and rather than going back and forth with response videos, we decided we'll have weekly discussions where one of us will critique the content of the other. The goal is to explore these ideas, find places that we can improve, and hopefully get a little bit closer to the truth. So if you like the content here, please like and subscribe. We'll be putting out more videos like this in the future. Now, on to the discussion. I hope you enjoy.
Well, as we have been doing in these episodes, we are taking a look at each other's videos that we've put together and just kind of pulling clips and things that we all want to offer critique on. But we're also trying to model a good exchange between people who disagree, trying to steelman one another's points, make sure we truly understand and are attacking or critiquing the best of each other's arguments. And then one other principle that we try to abide is to not try and convince one another of anything, but more so compare and contrast and to seek clarity in understanding the nature of our different points of view rather than trying to necessarily convince each other why we're right. And hopefully that leads to greater understanding, which oftentimes clarifies a lot. So thanks for joining me.
I actually want to add one thing to that too. And I think in the previous episodes, we've got a feel for it a little bit, and just like a little bit of epistemic humility. It's like we come at a lot of these are really complicated issues, and you'll feel yourself starting to dig in and wanting to like get your point right. And you're like, wait a minute, this is so hard. There's no like shame in not knowing the relationship between these, all these different pieces that are like super conceptually challenging. So I think we've done a pretty good job so far of like, not,
and I think a lot of the time
digging our heels in too much.
When we dig into the areas that are more fundamental, a lot of the times where we actually have genuine sort of disagreements, on fundamental kind of issues, there is more epistemic humility on both sides. And so it's easier for us to approach it more as curious explorers rather than as like ardent debate opponents who are trying to beat each other up. But there will be subjects where it's a little bit more, where we have a little more solid lines and we'll get after it a little more. Cool. So today I am playing the role of the critic, kind of critiquing one of Forrest's videos, and Forrest will be more or less playing the apologist, sort of defending his sort of position, or maybe what he
This never happens.
Yeah.
I'm never the apologist. What?
Exactly. Most people don't realize that, like, in any conversation, pretty much there's a critic and then there's the apologist. There's the one with who's offering the criticism and the one who has to defend whatever they've constructed. So it's good to mix it up, play both roles. All righty. So you made a video talking about the Western mind. I made a video originally. Actually, this is a response to your response. So I'm responding to your response to my video.
I'm here to defend it though.
I made a video talking about how Christianity has deeply influenced the way that we think in the Western world. And a lot of our conceptions in the West, if you take away Christianity, it really robs the West of sort of key ethical and sort of metaphysical ideas that have undergirded our society and a lot of the progress that was made. And one of the clips that I wanted to play here, is it 908 in this video? Let me prep it real quick. And it's on the subject of human rights. My contention was that the notion of rights is very much connected deeply to Christianity in the West and its influence on the West. And so in your video, you offer this segment, which more or less critiques that point of view. So let's watch it here.
Sure, that predated it, just like the rest of history.
Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law.
Cyrus the Great gives us evidence of human rights that predate Jesus by 500 years. And Greece and Rome also had this notion of human rights that predates Christianity.
This natural law. But it kept.
So I'm going to go to that point. Let me try and steelman what I think you're trying to get across there. The basic idea is that human rights were not invented by Jesus or Christianity. The notion of human beings having rights is a concept that has existed prior to Christianity and can be found in other societies, such as with Cyrus the Great. And then, Romans had certain notions of human rights, and maybe later in Western history, these were universalized, and maybe Christianity played some part in that. But the notion of human rights is something that is not a Christian idea. Is that a fair summation? What would you add or take away?
Yeah, I think this whole topic is hard because, for me at least, because I have a hard time even understanding what your argument is. But in that clip in particular, and in most of the video, it's basically this stuff didn't necessarily come from Christianity. Christianity played a role for sure. To what extent, it's very complicated, and there's not easy lines to be drawn. And then at the end of it all, I think our society is actually very different than what you would get if you just built a society out of Christianity.
Okay.
And in some of the most critical things that make the West so unique, it's like anti-Christian.
Okay.
Or some of those principles are anti-Christian.
So let's talk for a minute about just this notion of a right, okay? Because I think that there's a misunderstanding here of what I mean when I'm talking about a right, okay? A right, as I'm defining it, is not a privilege granted to you by the state, by the sovereign, by the one in power, okay? There's a difference in the concept of human rights and then privileges granted by the one in power. The way I look at Cyrus the Great, for instance, or other leaders, Cyrus was a very benevolent ruler. His concept was not one that people have some sort of... So actually, first, let me define what I mean by rights. A right is what is the word I'm trying to look for? Not inheritance. It is an entitlement that a person has, a moral entitlement, right? That they're entitled to due to some moral standard that exists above and beyond anyone else in the world, right? It isn't that the king gave you this right. Your right came from it was inherent in some sort of a moral order. It is what we're saying fundamentally is like, you have a right to your property, for instance, let's say. Well, that's just saying that it is wrong for someone else in a moral sense to take that away from you. And that is why if the government does something, like, it isn't justified just because the government does it, because the government is not the origin of that right or that moral standard that granted you that entitlement. Okay? So that's when I'm talking about rights. I'm not talking about the fact that he's like, hey, in my kingdom, I'll let anyone worship whatever God you want. You can all have freedom of speech or whatever. Look at me. I'm such a benevolent king for giving you all these privileges. Okay. Cyrus was very much of that type. He didn't have some philosophy that said you all have a moral entitlement from God and I'm just God's, I'm subject to this. And that's why, and not only does everyone have this, because it may have existed that some people felt like the gods want this and that's why I'll do it, but that it was universal in nature, that everyone, by virtue of just being human, a human right has to be universal to all human beings. Otherwise, it's not a human right. Okay? So my argument is is that sort of a conception very clearly was birthed out of the philosophy of liberty that emerged during the Enlightenment, and it emerged during the Enlightenment due to the challenges to the authority of both church and state that had just previously come during the Reformation period. The Reformation period was the great challenge both to church and state authority. And when the way you challenge authority is you have to say, we all are equal. The king is and the Pope is no greater than me. We're all equals in the eyes of God. And that creation of a universal view that all men were equal before God was literally instantiated into our Declaration of Independence in the words that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator, right? The rights don't come from the king, the rights come from the creator. And that is the basis for human rights in the West that developed. And if you take the entire Christian context out of that, and the notion that all men are equals before God, it robs that of its universality, and you're still left in the world of Cyrus the Great, where the sovereign holds the power and he bestows the privileges rather than the concept of rights. So that's my little speech there. So what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, I think for the most part, it is a narrative that doesn't make any difference. Okay. Because whether or not people believe they have these universal human rights, we still live in the world of Cyrus. And we will always live in the world of Cyrus. So you can say we all have human rights, and it's because of God, or it's because of Allah, or it's because of whatever magical fairy tale. Like, at the end of the day, we still live in the exact same place that we've always been, which is a world where the people with the power can take away our rights.
Okay, but the question is but this is the question. The question is, do you have rights at all? As I've defined them. Meaning, so, do you actually have a moral entitlement to anything?
I think, I'll say yes to that, but you're not going to like my yes, because I don't think we have a moral entitlement because we're entitled to it from God. I think that it's totally possible that I believe we have moral entitlements.
Well, and my thing is that to justify that people have a moral entitlement, there has to be something to say, why is a person entitled to anything? Why is it not ultimately power and preference? And
no, it is ultimately, it is power and preference. And you get what you get.
But that's
so this is where, like, I think you're not escaping the real world. You're just adding a story on top of it.
I'm positing a moral reality here. Okay. I'm positing the existence of the fact that
but what I'm saying is, does it make a difference?
Actually wrong to well, it makes a huge difference, because if indeed there is a moral entitlement that needs to be respected, a right, then the king can actually do wrong. He can actually be violating a moral law by violating the rights of others, and we can say that
is it different? Wrong. I think it's wrong.
Yes, but the king doesn't.
And in your worldview, it's the same dilemma.
No, it's not. Because in my worldview, the king
practical
is going to be held accountable to God. And the king,
you can say, king, you can't take this away because of God. And he's like, yeah, okay, I'll figure that out later when I die. But for now, I'm taking away your rights.
I think there might be a misunderstanding here. I'm not saying that your rights can't be violated. Of course your rights can be violated. The question is was there a right there at all in the first place to violate?
And this is sounding very much like the moral, like, I think it's totally possible to say, I think that I have these rights and I think you're violating my rights. Or even I have established my rights, or we have established our rights.
But that's fine. But I would say that those aren't rights.
Ultimate.
Those are your preferences. They're things that you want. There's no, in order something to be an entitlement connected to something moral, to a moral entitlement, there has to be some sort of a conception that there's some sort of a moral accountability if you violate the moral standard. Because
this is yeah, because it's very tied to the moral discussion to begin with.
it absolutely is. Because
And
real quick,
I don't believe
just so we recognize it, rights are nothing more than a moral entitlement. That's what they are. The whole concept of rights is the concept of morality. It says
so
that
my answer is, and this is where I'm just going to ask you: can I have a moral standard?
yes, but your moral standard is arbitrary and based on your own preferences.
Yes. So I have a moral standard, and with that, I have things that I believe are moral rights or moral rights.
I'm thinking about this. But because your standard is arbitrary and the king's
and I don't like arbitrary. Right. It is not arbitrary. It is my preference. But I have a lot of reasons, and I have a lot of factors, and there's
your preferences are arbitrary. Your preferences are based on your constitution and the culture you grow up in, and all of those different things.
Maybe I'll just grant it to you, but like I think arbitrary means like kind of like random. They're not random.
What I'm getting to though is that, and this comes down to the conundrum that I talk about individual humanism versus collective humanism, right? So if you are indeed an individualist humanist who thinks that my own individual well-being is the ultimate thing in life and the thing of most importance, well, what happens when you have someone who's the king who says, well, I will stomp all over your preferences to get what I want. And so there is no moral system there are no rights here. There are just people who say, I prefer this, you prefer that. In the system,
you just described the real world.
Well, that's fine. You can say that's the real world. What I'm saying though is that in the real world, in my conception of it, it is actually against the king's preferences to do harm to you and to rob you of your rights, because God will hold him accountable for his behavior. In your real world, hold on. In your real world, that doesn't exist. In my real world, that does. So these are different ways of conceptualizing, and whether or not what's the real world and what isn't, that's kind of beside the point here. The point is that there's a distinction. There's a distinction between the concept of rights and the concept of preferences and
but what I'm saying is, if the distinction doesn't affect the act, because you keep bringing up these examples, what are you going to do when you say, King, you can't take away my rights? And he says, yes, I can. I have the power. I'm like, I'm going to do exactly what I'll do in real life, which is fight or get killed or submit. And that's just the story of humanity.
It makes an enormous difference when a person feels that they have moral accountability, because they'll alter their behavior. The king will actually say to himself, and we will choose the king or elect the king or whatever, if it's a democratic system that has that value of there being actual human rights, because that grants us a level of assurity that he knows that he's not only accountable to his own whims, but that he's ultimately accountable to God.
And this is getting back. So this is a nice segue into back. So we're talking about does this did the West come from Christianity? Is that the foundation for our ethic, basically? And I would say the fact that we have a democracy is a great example of why now we check the power of the king by the vote. We don't check the power of the king by God. We just say, hey, in fact, that's what most of medieval Europe was. It was like, oh, the king's going to be held accountable to God. He'll act good. And then of course he doesn't. But now it's like, okay, that strategy didn't work. It didn't work having God be the arbiter or the accountability factor. We need to do it with our own vote. And with the masses.
And historically, the origins of the democratic system, while definitely influenced by the democratic systems that existed in classical antiquity were actually spurred. The reason they began to pop up post-Reformation was because in the Reformation was the era in which all of the authority structures were actually challenged. And they were challenged on the basis that we all had, that the plowboy had just as much authority from God as the Pope. And if all of us share in an equality of authority, well, then we all should be equals on earth. There is no one who is inherently has authority over others. And so
that seems to be very not Christian and definitely not Mormon.
No. Within the structure of civic government, absolutely. The idea here is that
why is there a separation between civic government and theocracy? Like, to me, that's a Western concept that is directly at odds with Christianity as well.
Directly emerged from Christianity. The very idea of the secular was something that arose from Christian thought in separating even the idea of religion from the non-religious. These are concepts that were very much rooted within Christianity. The only reason we even use the word secular today was from the saeculum, which was something that the Christian, I think it was Augustine.
Yeah, this is like Sam Harris's point where, yeah, of course, all of our stuff came through Christianity because there was no one else. Our heritage is Christianity. That's like, and I think he gave like a bridge. It's like saying like Christians build all the bridges. It's like, yeah, because all the people at the time were Christian. That doesn't mean that bridges were built because of Christianity.
Yeah, but no. But these
the term secular, sure,
these things were built. No. These were built very much in the way that Christians thought about the world and saw the world. Christians had in their mindset the idea, because of the scriptures, that all men were actually equals before God. Now obviously you can say, well, there were verses that said that, that would make you think otherwise.
Yeah,
but
and there was other cultures that also had some form of human rights. And I mean, it's like this universal aspect is weird because I don't know if anyone actually believes in universal.
Traditionally have been tribal, very, very tribal in nature.
What I'm saying is even Christianity.
Christianity was universalizing from the start with Paul saying there is no more Greek nor bond or free. There was the Christian movement from its inception had a very universal feel.
I heard this like not that long ago, a few days ago. The story of what was it, Jesus and
the Samaritan woman.
The Samaritan woman feeding scraps to the dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Like even Jesus himself was not a universalist.
No, not in the initial sort of thing that came out of it, but he later there's a lot of debate over those verses, just so you know. But here's the point that I'll make. Let's use Peter. Okay, it always was that the Jews were the chosen people, and it was a very tribal kind of thing. Jesus himself was an observant Jew. Peter's vision of the unclean things that he wasn't supposed to eat, and then he was told by God, don't call things that I've made clean unclean, eat. And it was the revelation that he was supposed to take the gospel to all people throughout all the world. And if you do read the New Testament, Jesus Christ said that he wanted to baptize all nations, go into all nations and all people, right? The Samaritan woman, if anything, is more of an anomaly.
But that doesn't be wanting to baptize everyone doesn't mean you believe in universal human rights.
Oh, absolutely.
Or that everyone is equal. It means, I want to go convert everybody. Yeah, of course.
Very clearly, when they wanted to take the gospel to the Gentiles and baptize people who are not of the Jewish faith, that was a big, big difference to the way things had been viewed historically. Paul's message that there is no more Jew nor Greek, and he clearly was blurring those lines and creating a universalized conception of humanity. And whether you think that they originally, whatever the people thought originally, the reality is that the Christians have interpreted that message to want to universalize Christianity to the whole world. Okay. And the trend has always been in that direction within the Christian movement. So what I'm saying is regardless of what happened initially, by the time of the Reformation, which was just an earth-shattering paradigm shift, when the Bible finally got into the hands of the common people and was widespread, the people reading the Bible, that's the message they got from it. And the first thing they did was they challenged the authority of the Pope. And then eventually they challenged the authority of their state structures. And that second part, the challenging of the state structures, was very much the fuel of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from the Christian Reformation.
So, best case scenario, you're saying the time of Jesus wasn't necessarily teaching this, but eventually it trickled down and was interpreted this way. And the result that you get is a universality of human rights, which can be taken away by the government because there's still the power preference problem. And that's basically the best case story, right? Like, I mean, where do you get democracy? Where do you get freedom of speech? Where do you get liberalism? I guess you could say.
Okay, let's go through each one of those kind of one at a time. Let's talk, because you talked about this in your video. I won't watch the clip because you kind of talk about this. So you say that there are these certain values like freedom of speech, democracy.
Actually, I have a question. Maybe this is a better way to put it. What do you think are, when you say Christianity made the West, what are a few of the defining characteristics of the West?
We could go with some of those ones you just mentioned. You said freedom of speech.
Because that's what I was like, oh, those are, okay. I think I Googled it.
We can say freedom of speech. We could say, we could talk about religion. Freedom of religion, and we could talk about democracy. Okay, we can talk about all of that. Okay, now here's the thing about all of these. All of these actually are not separate things. They're all out.
Well, they're all under. Okay, so they're under the umbrella of human rights.
They're under the yes,
but
they're under the umbrella. They're under the umbrella of liberty. The philosophy of liberty. If there was a word that came out of it, but where did this idea come from of liberty? The philosophy of liberty is rooted in the notion of self-ownership. Okay? It's the idea that you, when it comes to other people, no one else has an entitlement on your life, your liberty, or your property more than you. Okay? And so you are fundamentally...
So this is where it's fun. That's a great idea, but that's just not how it works.
Yeah, but that was the idea that built the West. Okay? When people don't all steal from each other and feel that there is a moral law that they're entitled to that says you can't.
This is the I love this from Hitchens too. This is like, do you really think that that there weren't societies, like, what does he always say? If they had believed it was okay to steal from each other, they wouldn't have made it this far.
No,
there's plenty of societies that understand that.
Hold up, you got to remember. You can say, okay, are these Christian values? Are these Western values? You can put any label on you that you want to. The question is, are they true values? Is it true that human beings have an entitlement to their own labor? A moral entitlement?
I believe that, or it is my preference that people have, I believe people have an entitlement.
Okay. The difference is that people who prefer that everyone has an entitlement to their own goods is different from saying that you are accountable to God universally.
Yeah, but that accountability has not worked out very well. So we've made real life changes. Now you're accountable to us. If the government wants to, if the federal government wants to march troops into our cities, and the leadership is going to get ousted.
Well, and that's fine. That's fine. You can go that route. You can say that ultimately those in power are the ones who the might makes right. If they're in charge, they can't like violate a moral law because they set the law.
No, according to my standard, they violated a law.
Well, they didn't violate any law. They violated your preference.
Yeah, that is my standard. And so therefore, I need to use my power and preference to keep my moral standard at the top.
And so it's just a Hobbesian nightmare of who has the power. And
Yeah, but that's the world you live in. So it's not.
fine.
I mean, if you think the
okay,
world's a nightmare, then you think the world's a nightmare. But
if you grant that, well, then there is no such thing as universal human rights. There's just power and preference.
well, or there's, I believe, according to my standard, everyone has universal human rights. You need to add the word like ultimate or objective.
Well, but the thing is, fine, objective. There's nothing there to say that people actually have entitlements. There's just things that you prefer that people have, and there's things that other people prefer that people have. Now, regardless of what the reality is, my point is there's a big difference from saying you need to do this because I prefer it. You need to respect people's rights because I prefer it, and saying you will be held accountable to some cosmic standard of justice if you violate our rights. It is wrong to do
The
that.
only difference is a linguistic difference, or it is a narrative difference. The reality is, if you tell the king, if you can't violate my rights because you will be held accountable to God, he'll say, I live in the normal world of the Hobbesian nightmare, and I can do what I want.
Yeah, so what happens is
I feel like this is like a Hitchens razor. Like you
no,
can
it's
assert that.
It's a simple thing. I'm saying that, yeah, if there is no God, you're right. But if there is a God, that king is going to suffer in hell for eternity or whatever the case may be.
I agree, but what I'm saying is,
so
it doesn't make a difference right now.
King's actions, do you see how the king's actions might be restricted if he realizes that he is not the ultimate authority on earth?
Yes, and we've realized that is not a good model to assume. So luckily for all of us,
no, I would say that my whole point in this whole thing is that is the model that the West assumed, and that's the reason that universal human rights grew out in the West. And
so then why do we have a democracy?
History,
the whole point of a democracy is that we actually have the real power.
Go ahead. What would you say?
I said, then why do we have a democracy? The whole point of a democracy is we've realized, like, hey, at least as far as the earth goes, we're the only ones. We got to look out for ourselves here, because we can say God's going to punish this guy, but it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of effect on him. You know what would have an effect is if we hold the power over him, and we can take away his power.
Why not both?
Because it's power and preference. So the preference of all of us and our cumulative power can actually supersede the power of an authority, like a king or a president.
Why not both? I think that's what we did. I think what we said is that we both created a moral standard by which we said we're going to judge and try and elect our leaders, meaning we want to put people in power who believe that they're accountable to God, because we believe that will hold back their avarice. And then we also said, and we're going to put in additional structures in place to help to check that power itself.
And so I totally agree with that. I agree with that. But when you say something made the West, the structures that are in the real world are the things that are made.
No.
The narrative that they're going to be held accountable after the fact, that's not the West. The West is democracy. The West isn't. There's an overarching narrative.
Well, first of all, we're not a democracy, and in fact, democracy is a terrible form of government.
I mean, you know, kind of what I'm saying. Basically,
I know what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that there's a reason for that. It's because our society did not build itself on pure democracy; it built itself on the concept of human rights. And in fact, our democracies are curtailed exactly in response to the fact that we believe that people have human rights, and that's the reason we don't have a pure democracy. And so these concepts, and the other thing is no, it is not the structures that built the West. You can have any sort of political structure that you want. If you have crappy people who steal and rob and are dishonest and Machiavellians, you don't get a cooperative society.
Yeah, but I would flip it the other way. You can have structures. You can have a value structure, or you can have a claim of eternal justice all you want. But if you don't have a structure on earth that it implements it, then it makes no difference. you're going to have crappy people running amok because an
Actually,
actual structure is what's important.
Actually, if you have enough people, as John Adams said, if people are angels, no government is necessary. And in fact, as a people are more able to self-govern according to a moral standard that is a good moral standard that actually promotes universal human well-being, the less you need the structures at all.
Yeah, but like I've talked about in previous episodes, we both agree that you can have well-being without an eternal standard or an objective. I guess you could say that is an objective standard, but without like a yeah.
But here's what I would say. I would say no, not without cosmic justice. Because if you don't have cosmic justice in the equation of your moral system, then your moral system says, yeah, if you can get away with it, then lie or steal or cheat.
So this is where we're going to have to, at one point, we're going to have to maybe get away from a video thing and just do a morality discussion so I can present my moral framework, just because this whole, if you can get away with it, I don't think that's the real world.
Well, let's take a look at something real quick. And I actually, you actually do have a certain amount of a point there. Obviously, I can't get into all the details now, but I do agree that there is a level of self checks and balances within living in a society that creates some of that. But it's a separate topic. I do want to go into, though, the idea of freedom of speech, because you brought it up specifically in the video. Freedom of speech is a subset of a different freedom. It's not its own thing. It emerges as a logical consequence of us all being equals. If I'm an equal with you, then what's to say that you can say whatever you want, but I can't? Right? So
God.
What was that?
God has restrictions on speech.
God's restrictions on speech are moral injunctions, not state-imposed injunctions, according to what I believe to be true Christianity. To have blasphemy laws, for instance, blasphemy commandments within the structure of like scripture or something like that, it's one thing for me to say, Forrest, you should not tell your wife that she's a fat idiot. And it's another thing for me to actually use a law that stops you from being able to do certain, from being able to express certain
I agree,
ideas.
but that differentiation, I don't know how you're making that. As in, like, where, if Christianity was this foundation, where was this justification for saying, no, we need to actually separate the religion from civic laws?
Are you asking where's the
Like, the
Christian
separation
connection?
of church and state is almost, I would argue.
Separation of church and state is an easy one. That is absolutely resulted because of the Christian idea of separating the secular from the religious, which is a Christian idea that emerged out of Christianity and nowhere else on earth.
But I don't, for one, I don't know my history well enough, but where and how is that justified? There's also a little bit of an issue that I'm having.
Very early on,
Augustine, you're having people.
About this,
Who?
Augustine talked about the city of God and the city of man. Okay. And what he basically said is there's a difference between the structures of the temporal world and things of spiritual concern. Okay. The city of God, the city of man. And what he said was that the city of man is the cyculum, which was this notion of kind of the fleeting and the things that pass away, but the eternal stuff is sort of that we need to bind ourselves to, which is religio, which is this idea of binding something. This stuff all emerged within Christianity, and that there was a mindset that there was a separation between these two things. Jesus Christ himself is actually the origin of this, when Jesus Christ talked about, my kingdom is not of this world. Within the New Testament, there's a clear delineation between the kingdom of Caesar and the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And those are the notions within Christian tradition that created the seedbed that eventually said, by the time of the Reformation, when they wanted to begin to say, hey, we want to reject the authority of the Pope, well, they recognized that the Pope and the religious structures were integrated with the civic structures, and they said we need to actually separate those from one another, because there were really, it's a bad deal. Because the secular and the idea and basically they could see that the affairs of Caesar and the affairs of Jesus had been commingled.
Yeah, I just think it's a stretch to say that throughout the whole Bible and then Jesus, and then from Jesus to the Reformation, this idea wasn't a thing. And then the Reformation happens because people are getting irritated with the leadership, and the
Oh
people
no,
basically overthrow
what
leadership.
happened
And
was
now
what
you attribute it to being a Christian principle.
Well, Christianity started as a small kind of radical group. What happened was when Constantine eventually took Christianity and made it the state religion of Rome, there were a ton of people who joined the Christian church that were joining it because it was the official state religion. Okay. Christianity, when it was basically taken over by the Roman Empire, was essentially bastardized into the Roman Empire. And so what you had was essentially the continuation of the Roman Empire, but Christianity was kind of inside of it.
But imagine
Christian
if you were at that
church-
time, what justification? You could literally go to the Old Testament for justification for why there is no separation between God's kingdom and the kingdom of man.
not
Like
in
the Old
New
Testament is full of
Yeah.
societies living by God's law.
And in fact, it is in fact that is one of the New Testament messages that Jesus Christ brings to the world. All of the Jews expected Jesus to be the political Messiah. They expected him to show up with a sword in hand saying, "We're going to kick some Roman ass." And instead he shows up and he says, "Love your neighbors." And he says, like, and that's one of the reasons that the Zealots and other Jews hated Jesus, was because he's saying he's the Messiah, but like, bro, you're not the Messiah. You're here to make Israel great again. You're not here to go and like make
Yeah, but I
friends
still
with
don't see
Romans.
how you get the separation of church and state from that.
Because Jesus Christ fundamentally said, "My kingdom is not of this world."
Yeah,
He came
that's
into
a stretch. The
No, it's
kingdom
not
of
a
not of
stretch.
this
That's-
world.
that's
The kingdom of
essential
God.
to
Yeah, sure.
Go and read.
Sure,
go
the
and
kingdom of
read
God is not
Augustine.
earth. Well,
It is
and this
very
is
much clear that the kind of kingdom that Jesus Christ was bringing to the world was a different kind of kingdom. It was a kingdom that was in each one
so
of us.
what year was Augustine?
I think Augustine was like 300 something. The first 300 years of Christianity.
But I mean, and even then, like, it's not until the Reformation that this is even put into practice.
Yes, and you want to know why? It's because the entire
Because you had a bunch of
Christian-
people that were really irritated with the Pope.
Yeah, because guess what? Because for
And
the
then
past ever
they
since the
picked and
Pope-
choose some Bible verses to justify it.
because the Pope was basically a pawn of the continuation of the Roman Empire. Why do you think the Pope is located in Rome? Remember,
But
Rome
remember,
became
you were making the argument that if you have this justification that God will judge you, then people are going to act well. You had the Pope himself as acting
You
improperly.
think the popes, a lot of the popes were far more political actors than spiritual actors in any sense of the
No,
imagination.
I know, and that's my
Because
point.
the
My point is,
political
it is not a
structure-
good strategy to rely on punishment in the afterlife to regulate human action.
Oh, it most certainly is, but it isn't foolproof. My whole point is this: if you look historically at the origin of our Western notion of human rights, you can trace it back to the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment ideas about liberty were rooted in the ideas of equality amongst all people, of authority, things like the priesthood of all believers, which arose from the Reformation. And those ideas arose from the notions of New Testament Christianity, which remember, nobody even had the New Testament in mass, like in large scale, until the printing press. Once the New Testament got out and everyone started reading it, there was an intellectual and ethical like reformation of Western society based on the principles in that book, which they all held as the standard. And that is from that emerged the Western world. The Enlightenment came out of the Reformation, and the Reformation came out of the New Testament. And to say otherwise is just to ignore the history.
No, to me, it's more a matter of causation. It's like hard to argue that it's like, yeah, these ideas came out of those places, but whether or not the Reformation happened as a result of people being irritated, and then maybe they used the Bible to justify some of their actions, that may be the case, but it doesn't mean...
There's been a million irritated people in human history. There's been a million oppressed people in human history. No, everyone wants their own liberation.
Yeah, but what I'm saying...
What's weird is to have a movement that wants universal liberation of all mankind. That's never happened before. That's why slavery ended. That's why the West pushed. That's why tribalism, as it has existed in humankind in large extent, ended in the world, or one of the major factors to that was this universalized message.
But like, even this is where again I point you back to the real world. It's like tribalism is not ended. Universal human rights is a thing that we talk about in theory, but in no way is it actually applied.
The thing is, if you compare it to utopia, sure, we're not there yet. You compare it to the world in 500 AD, we are a heck of a lot closer. And we're way less tribal. And human rights, again.
I know, but one of the big themes in that video was, this is super complicated. So for anyone to be like, oh, I know, blah, blah, blah. It's like, for example, there could be this progression of we're limiting tribes and adding more people to our tribes and having larger groups until eventually it becomes universal. Perhaps that was because the world itself was just getting explored more. We were able to communicate more. Now we're able to actually see videos of people in Africa. So now a starving kid in Africa actually affects us. So now our tribe isn't just the people we talk to, it's growing. And now we see that, hey, these people that are on the other side of the world aren't so different from us. Like, perhaps that's why.
To some extent, I think that's true.
But that's one of like a million factors that is not taken into account when someone makes this bold claim that Christianity built this, and if you get rid of Christianity, it's gone.
Well, if the thing is, if you ask what are the major factors that developed Western civilization, okay, clearly the idea of universal human rights.
What I'm saying is that would be. It's hardly even that clearly articulated in the Bible. And you know that because the apostles themselves weren't that clear on it. They didn't even follow it that clearly themselves. Like I said, Jesus himself wasn't that clear. If this was like the message of the Bible, then it would have been nice if it was like, hey guys, this is very clear. This is what we're preaching. Universal human rights. But then you have Jesus like talking about Samaritan woman as a dog asking for scraps.
Yeah. And Jesus ends up blessing her.
Yeah, but only after she basically
Jesus went to the Samaritans. If you're making the case that the New Testament message is a tribal one more than it's a universal one, you're going to have a hard time.
No, my case is that it's not clearly universal.
It's pretty clearly universal.
And so to make a clear, like, this came out of Christianity claim, it's like, man, this would be a lot stronger of a claim if it was an obvious connection here, but it's not.
It's pretty obvious, especially when you put it in the context of the world at that time. This was like nothing anyone had ever done before. To have a religion in that sort of I'm gonna make a claim that I can't really back up with much. If you give me time to look up religions, I bet I can find some claims of universality. Wonderful. And frankly, that doesn't change my point. My point isn't that it came from Christianity. My point is that it's true. Well, and that because these things are true, because human beings actually have human rights, that they do. And number two, that is what leads to great advances in civilization. And it was Christianity that was the vehicle that brought that truth to the world. Or let's say that spread that truth to the world more than any other vehicle.
I would be more willing to grant you, and this might be a small point, but I'd be more willing, not that I'm really going to grant it, but I'd be more willing to grant you Christians may have brought that. But whether it was because of Christianity might be harder, a harder justification.
Well, I think that's about as far as we're going to get in this one. It is getting really late, and I think we've already gone over the time that we wanted to do. But anyway, fun discussion, Forrest.
Yeah, we'll keep doing it. I'm excited.
All righty. Okay, everyone. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Hope you all have a great night. Take care.
All right. Thanks. Yeah. That's all I've got. I'm Forrest, Latter-day Skeptic. Please like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.